Hello, my friends, my lovely audiences. Welcome to the East West Show. Jack Chow, your host on the East West Show with ICT TV. With the affiliation with CBS, we're getting more and more influential, thanks to everybody, including you yourself as my audience, and also my guest, though. And it is not possible without their support. And of course, and this is not the first time I put this gentleman on the show, and most of you would guess that we're talking about water. Water. California has the forever problem with a single word that can describe water. So with me on the right-hand side today is my dear friend, dear Tony. Tony Zampiello. He is the Regional Director of California Water Master. Sir, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
All right. And to his right-hand side is my friend Ken Manning. Ken Manning is the Regional Director of California Water Quality. Right. So to both of you, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Last time you were here, it was about the beginning of summer. Now the summer is gone, the winter is already here. So how are we doing so far on water in general?
Well, a couple of things to update since we talked. You know, our year for the Water Master goes from June 30th to July 1st. So after we talked, we got in all of those final numbers and looked at them. And we were a little disappointed because we saw that water consumption went up by about 6 or 7% over the year before. And it's critical because that helps us keep the levels in the basin. Some of the good news is that, you know, so far the rain season, which starts October 1st, has started out to where we had one real good storm that most people remember, the week before last, or last week, I guess it was. We got about a little over an inch of rain, and so for the rain season,
A little over an inch.
where we measure at Pudding Stone in San Dimas, there were some areas like up in the hills in Pasadena, they measured 3 inches, but the measuring. The actual measuring station that we use for the valley floor was 1.33 inches.
Which would be a total of what since October?
About 3.3 inches.
Yeah.
So
How
it's
do
actually
you
very
see
good.
about the overall situation?
Well, I mean, putting the crystal ball out there and trying to look forward, I think this last 2 storms that we've had are a good indication that we might be in for an average or better than average year. That's all positive. I think what Tony's first comment about the fact that usage has gone up is somewhat alarming because we need to be able to get our customers to be able to try and restrain themselves from using too much water. And I would hope that during these wet days, they're turning their sprinklers off and trying to conserve water so that we can make it through the winter with less water and then have more for the summer.
The way I feel that the peak of the consumption time of the year is over. And now with the winter coming, more or less we have some water. We had some rain last week. And it is said that within the next 3 days, starting today, tomorrow and day after, we shall have 3 days of considerably like 3 inches of rain. So
Yeah,
is
hopefully.
that too optimistic, or is that something true?
No, I think it's all a good sign, and I think that that we're hearing the same forecasts. The one thing that would be nice is if we have these periodic storms all the way out into the beginning or the end of April, and then that's what really will matter. It's very difficult if you have one big storm to capture all of that water, but if you have a series of storms that go through, the watershed gets conditioned and things are in place to better have the water absorbed into the groundwater table. So.
Yeah, the perfect storm for us is in terms of the San Gabriel Valley, because we do have the San Gabriel River, which percolates a lot of the water coming out of the watershed. If we get rainstorms in the 1/2 inch to 1 inch range, the county through flood control is able to percolate that water into the ground without any problem. When you get above an inch, it starts to get problematic, especially if you get back-to-back storms. So we're looking if the series of storms that are coming in right now are coming in about the right frame in terms of about a week and a half apart. That's perfect because that allows you a chance to get the water into the ground that's been percolated from the last storm and free up space for the new storm to come down. And then of course there's the dam system that we've got up in the Azusa Canyon here that also collects the watershed. And up there we get quite a bit more rain. Where down here we may get 1 and 1.5 inch rain. Up there they may get 3.5, 4 inches of rain.
On average, we're expecting 1 or 2 or 2 or 3 inches
That's great.
That's what they're saying.
within that range, right?
Yeah.
Like this much?
Yeah, and it depends on really where you live, because it depends on, these storms don't come in and just uniformly pour rain. A lot of times they'll move around a little bit. So maybe if you're in downtown Los Angeles, you may get a half inch, but out here you may get a 3/4 to an inch.
Would that alleviate the pressure?
Oh, it helps. We're so far behind in terms of what we pulled out of the basin that we need 2 or 3 wet years before we could really even start to think that we're gaining. You know, an example is one of the other figures is that rain brought in about 500 acre feet that were stored up in the canyon, but the demand of the treatment plants was more than 500 acre feet. So instead of thinking of it as a gain, it slowed the decline. And that's, you know, that's
Anyway,
really,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the
I mean,
most.
the simple answer is yes, it is a help, but it doesn't solve our problem. Again, going back to that whole bank account analogy that we use periodically, is that we were able to get some money saved, but it's not nearly as much as we took out during the bad time.
To basically understand it, it's kind of a trend of going to versus the negativities, but not going actually to the positivity.
Well, yeah, it's if you think of it as a hill, and you start with a steep hill, and anything positive you do makes it less steep, but we're still not to where we're the other way yet. We're not uphill
still not
yet.
going up
Yeah,
yet,
yes.
right? Okay, very good. From where I live, I often drive go on Garvey towards the east to Rosemead area. I go by a river underneath. I don't know how you call that river.
The Rio Hondo River?
The Rio Hondo River,
Yeah.
right? I started to see as of this last rain though, some water in there.
Yes.
It's been dry, totally dry.
Yeah.
Dry as a crack,
Right.
ever since. But starting the last rain, I started to see some water. I need to check again if the water is gone, but I do see substantial water there.
Yeah.
It's probably subsided some. Some of those channels that are tributary to the river are made to move the water into centralized areas as fast as they can away from the houses.
Where does the water go though?
Well, it depends on exactly what part of the river you're talking about, but there, if you look at an aerial map of the San Gabriel River,
Garvey and Rosemead, that area.
if you looked at an aerial there's a dam in Whittier Narrows or down in like Pico Rivera, and then on the side of either side of that dam and even in the river, it's sand bottom, and so it'll go down to there, and then they have these little inflatable dams that they'll put in the river and keep the water and then let it percolate down.
Oh, okay. Anyway, it's not going into the ocean, right?
Well, that's what Ken was referring to. Once you get above certain huge storms in 24 hours, you may get some of it
But right now, no.
No.
Well, I'd rather see that.
Absolutely.
I'd rather see that.
So would we.
the other day, because I'm involved with water so much though. My wife follows.
Yeah.
When I kind of almost yelled. I said, "Wow, water!"
Yeah.
And I never saw water. And she says, "It goes to the ocean anyway."
No.
So
no, it
not
doesn't.
going to the ocean.
No, as a matter of fact, I think flood control, first of all, flood control does an outstanding job of capturing on behalf of all the citizens the most amount of water they can, especially in the San Gabriel and Rio Hondo watershed area. But if water is falling in the San Gabriel Valley up to an inch of rain, 100% of that water is going to stay in the San Gabriel Valley. It won't make it.
That's even better than you have a huge flood coming in all the way, and then
Right.
Yes.
goes to the ocean 24 hours.
Then it becomes an operation of less conservation and more safety.
Yes.
All right, very good. And then, by the way, from to the north of where we are, West Covina, though, you see the dam, right, by 605, that
Yes.
dam, though.
Santa
That
Fe.
dam, I recall that dam long ago, when even during my first days, early days in Los Angeles, I've never seen a drop of water over that dam. What was the dam for? Was there, or had there been any water in history?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
dam was built solely for flood control purposes. What Ken and I have been trying to do with local Congress people is to change the view of the federal government to using it more for conservation. But I don't know when you came to the valley, but in 1968, 1969, there were huge fires like are going on in Northern California now,
okay.
and the watershed was burned, and then these huge
Rain events.
followed them. So there were mass amounts of water coming down the river, and that's when that dam and the other one down below that I talked about, that's when they really, that's what their design point was to keep that water from overtopping the river, and then they try and if you have a year like that where there's these huge amounts of water, then they try and get it moving south towards the ocean as fast as they
In
can.
other words, it still functions.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Early in the 20th century, 1914, and then again in 1936, there were 2 huge years of rain. And during those 2 years, almost everything that was along the San Gabriel River was wiped out by flooding. And so right after the 1936 flood, the federal government came in and built Whittier Narrows and Santa Fe Dam along the San Gabriel River in order to be able to protect downstream facilities.
see.
So every bridge, every home along the edge, all those were wiped out in those 2 floods.
All right,
and so
okay.
that's why those 2 are there, and it's also why other significant dams, El Prado, out in the Inland Empire.
That makes a
others
lot
are
of
bigger.
sense. So let's take a short break out. Kind of when we come back, I'll explain to you why I ask about the dam. So stay with us. We'll be right back, my dear audiences. Hello, dear friends, my lovely audiences, my dear fellow Californians. Welcome back to the talk about California water. California is a beautiful state. And of course, in lots of areas, we are ugly. But one of the questionable area is that we are always a lack of water. We're dry. We're very dry. And okay, anyway, that's how dry we are. And look at the mandate, look at the little rain we have. So we know the problem is right there. It is a talk for generation after generation to go on. And the last time we were on the show, we talked about to have so far make a determination to change our lifestyle, which later on we'll touch, right? Today with me are these 2 wonderful individual professionals who I, at this show, rely upon on a day-to-day basis. And every now and then, we put together a show with all the information about our water. And for that, we had lots of attention, including our CBS system. They like our attention to water, right? Good. Now, with me is my friend, Tony Zampiello. He is the regional director of Watermaster of California, and Mr. Ken Manning, he is the regional director for water quality. With them, we have water and we have quality water. That's it, right? And if you guys retire, so we're done. Never retire, please. Okay, now, I'm kidding. I ask you some questions about infrastructures, water infrastructures, right? The reason I'm asking is that I want to relate it to the last midterm election. Did that help with the propositions passed?
Well, Proposition 3 was on the ballot. On election night, Proposition 3 was trailing. The yeses were at about 46%, and no's were about 48, 49%, something like that. It was close. They were very close, but it was about 2 or 3 percentage points difference, and so it was failing. The proposition was failing. With all of the late voting that occurred and all the provisional ballots that are being counted right now, that all have to be finished within the next few days.
All right.
Actually, now the Secretary of State's office has put Proposition 3 into the too close to call category, and they don't know what the result of Proposition 3 is going to be, probably for a few more days. But if the votes that are trending over the last 4 or 5 days continue to come in that way, Proposition 3, which was a $7 billion bond measure, will have passed by a couple of votes, maybe by less than a half a percentage point. And so we still don't know what the results are going to be. There is, like I said, $7 billion in there. The majority of that money was put in the ballot measure for the benefit of the central San Joaquin Valley, to provide water or to provide money for infrastructure on water for agricultural purposes. So the bond measure, for the most part, was benefiting mostly through the San Joaquin Valley. There was money in there for groundwater cleanup for all of the state, but about $4 billion of the $7 billion was for the central San Joaquin Valley. And so it's going to help in terms of paying additional expenses for additional facilities, dams. And there are 2 or 3 new dams that are being looked at in California. Those very likely could be the very last reservoirs that are created in the state of California because of environmental pressures. But there is additional money in the bond measure for that. So if that passes, the benefit is, 1, we'll have additional storage, and 2, we do have money for additional groundwater and groundwater cleanup. So that will all benefit. But we're still, at this point, it's still razor close as to whether or not the bond is actually passed or not. If it doesn't pass, we probably will have another bond in the in 2 years.
All right, all right. I don't know if it's a water quality question or is a water master question. If California had a choice, had to choose in between the two, number 1, build reservoirs, more reservoirs for more water reservation. Number 2, to dig and clean more groundwater. But we have one choice to choose though in between. Which works more effectively?
Well, I think, you know, in looking what Ken said about the last few reservoirs being built, I think we could more effectively use the groundwater basins if we had more surface reservoirs. Because again, going back to what we talked about in the first segment about the ability to catch larger volumes, it takes a certain amount of time for the water to percolate into the ground. So if you have a big surface reservoir, a lot of states like Texas, almost all of their storage is surface storage. So it fluctuates quite a bit, but you can capture big volumes if you leave. You know, we don't have, that's why we talk about the space that's been created from pumping the groundwater basin. That's much more advantageous in a surface reservoir because, for example, this last storm, that whole area, that reservoir, plus all of the watershed draining into it, you're capturing 100% of it. Whereas with the groundwater basin, it needs a certain time to get into it. So if you have more surface reservoirs, then you can timely release the water, you maximize the groundwater storage.
In other words, they are interrelated.
Absolutely interrelated, and it's a matter of operation. If you think about it, the water, if you have large storms, and if you get up in the mountains, they get large amounts of water, even though we may get a moderate on the valley floor. In the mountains, they get about 2 or 3 times more rain than we do on the valley floor. That water comes out of that watershed. If we can catch that behind reservoirs, dams, then we can release it slowly down into the valley floor where we can allow it to percolate into the groundwater. So it's an operational question. The reservoirs provide us operational flexibility to be able to get that water into the ground over a long length of time so that we can maximize that water and it doesn't flow out to the ocean. So that's really what we're trying to do. In terms of a choice between water quality and water quantity has to come first, then water quality follows.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. In other words, we really do not have to choose between, because they are not fighting each other. No. They are interrelated to each other, right? Okay, now, so in other word, with that cleared up as a ground level, though, we want to make it clear to my audience that you're voting against the measures to stop the funding zone might not help the situation. So anything's banned, either the groundwater or the surface reservoirs, would help you conserve water.
Yes.
Is that a right take?
I think really what we've gotten into, and Ken is far better versed in the politics, but what we've gotten to, in my view, in California, is that a lot of things get shoved on the ballot that should be settled by the elected folks, and that the details can be hashed out. So what I tell people when they ask me, they look at their ballot, is you really just don't look at the title. So if it says it's a water, it's a water bond, or it's a clean water bond, or it's this or that, you really have to look, and the devil's in the details, to see how that's carved up and how it might, the county-wide Measure W was very much based, a lot of the commercials were based on capturing more stormwater, but the main goal of it is really to reduce the amount of water with high bacteria and other things in it out into the channels and the rivers.
I'm very happy you mentioned that. You mentioned the word legislature, right? So far, according to what I have learned, that the money before, right, up now before, had not been precisely used on water. I mean, the water money. So how do you say, what's your comment about that, about money not being precisely used on water?
Well, in the past, let's talk about past bonds. And I'm talking, when I say past bonds, bonds prior to Proposition 1, which was a few years ago. Bonds prior to that many times were called water bonds, but over 50% of the money was going to environmental purposes.
All right.
To buy land,
That's
or
why I'm asking, yes.
or to preserve things that weren't necessarily water related, in terms of getting our customers water. So in many cases, they're using water in the title because it helps attract votes. These last few bonds, including the Proposition 3 and Proposition W on the LA County ballots, those were strictly water related. There were very few in Proposition 3 environmental issues in there, although there were a few that were incorporated. But still, 95% of the money in that was going towards water issues. So yeah, water industry has been used over and over again in the past to promote environmental type issues. Some of them very, very good. Some of them depends on where you look.
So back then, with the Proposition 1, though, they call something not exactly water related water bond, though, and that did work, right?
Yes.
So they learned the lesson. They continue calling everything water bound, though, and then on the other hand, the people, when hearing lots of crying wolves, they get numb.
Yes.
That's the political
part of the problem.
That's the political phenomena that we have to really pay attention to. Is that right?
Well, the interesting thing about this last water bond that Ken explained so well, how the vote's going, the reality of it is that it really wasn't opposed. There wasn't any outward opposition to it, but a lot of people that do this kind of thing thought there might be a fatigue amongst the voters as to, well, how many water bonds are we going to pass?
Yeah,
but in
right,
reality,
yeah.
It was a smaller bond, but it may have had more to do, and Ken, you correct me, more to do exactly with water at a smaller bond than some of the others, but people
Take me
get tired
myself,
of
for example. The last vote, I voted no on number 3, because I learned the lessons on number 1.
Yeah.
So should I heard you? Had I heard your explanation about now, I would have given a yes.
Yeah.
I believe lots of folks are kind of like did what I did, right? Okay, my dear lovely audiences, we take a short moment and we just hit a point, how to connect the political efforts to really the people, right? So stay with us. dear friends, my lovely audiences, my dear fellow Californians, welcome back to the talk about water. Water, 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 that's a big word. And we, California, have been head scratching for a long, long time over that water. So today with me are two wonderful professionals. I call them the men of water, right? Well, anyway, their name sounds it. So Mr. Tony Zampiello was the water master. So he is the master of water. And Mr. Ken Manning with the water quality. So like I said, quantity of water, quality of water, we have the two Qs of water. So welcome back to the show. All right, now, we just now hit a very good point, right? Political point and reality point. When these two collide, we see a problem. Why problem? Because when we found out the money of Proposition number 1 2 years ago was not properly spent, as a matter of fact, that was not even actually water money, we lose our confidence in trusting them with the Proposition number 3 this year. Like I said, take me myself, for example, I voted no to number 3. So, and my point is that when people, the voters at large, they hear the crying wolves over and over again, they get tired. So next thing you see, whichever way they ask for water money, they will not give them. Would that happen? Does that sound scary?
Well, it can happen, and I think in the case of Proposition 3, if it does pass, it will be the closest margin we've had on a water bond for decades. And I think the reason is just what you're talking about. Now, Proposition 1, when it was constructed, Proposition 1 was largely water related. There were some environmental issues that were taken care of in Proposition 1, but it was one of the first water bonds, that was really specifically for the water industry up and down the state of California. And in fact, it incorporated $2.7 billion for infrastructure towards large projects like getting water, building dams, new reservoirs. And so that 2.7 now has been allocated out, and they're still having to spend it, but at least they've allocated that $2.7 billion out. There was also another $800 million in there for groundwater quality and for a lot of other issues. But what happens is that when we get propositions back to back to back like we did, with Prop 1, then Prop 68, and now Prop 3, is that it takes the state literally years to distribute the money from those propositions. So they haven't spent probably all, but they probably spent maybe half of Proposition 1. So there's probably $3.5 to $4 billion still to distribute there. Proposition 68, there's still almost all of that has to be distributed. And now we were throwing Proposition 3 on top of it. And I think the voters basically, for the most part, said, we're not sure we need that much money that quickly. And I think they were right. I think that the money that we were seeing that was being incorporated in Prop 3 really needs to be voted on in 2020, not 2018, because that's going to put it in a time frame that we can use the money for water infrastructure.
Then why are they asking money in such a manner?
Well, I think when you have something that you want to convince people to vote for, it's not necessarily dishonest, but it's really, it's kind of like the old saying, buyer beware. I think that it's like the old saying where, buyer beware. More than ever, the ballot measures, in my view, that I get at my house, you would think they're simple things that you're voting on, but by voting yes, you may be repealing something that's already in place, or you may be substituting something that's less effective for you as to more. And I think a good example was like with the gas tax. The gas tax, we need money for infrastructure. We need to take care of the roads. If anybody's driven on the roads in Southern California, we need to do that. I think when the people that put it back on the ballot were more concerned as to how that money was distributed. Ken talked a minute ago about who administers these bonds, how you can apply for them, who gets them. And so it's kind of that way, but it was, if you voted, whatever way you voted, regardless of whether you wanted the gas tax repealed, you had to vote yes to make it a no to repeal the tax, and and I think really that it's, the other thing that I get on my ballot a lot are judges. I had probably 25 judges on my ballot, and one thing that my parents taught me is if you don't know what you're voting for, don't vote for it. Don't vote yes or no. So I tried to do my research because it's important who the appellate court judges are. It's the same thing with the propositions, and I think what's tougher for people nowadays is there are far more propositions on the ballot than there used to be. They used to be straightforward, one or two on the ballot. Now there can be competing ones where if you vote yes for one and no for the other, you've basically reversed what you want to do.
Yeah, you comment about that?
No, I think Tony's right in terms of, I think for the most part we've gotten into a trend where you got to remember that a lot of political consultants make a lot of money on these propositions. And by putting them on the ballot, they're able to make money for themselves and keep their business going. Their business is creating propositions. So that all plays into it. But I think the main thing is that voters need to be aware of what it is they're voting. They need to read those, at least what they're sent by the Registrar of Voters and the Secretary of State in order to be able to understand what they're actually voting for. In the case of Proposition 3, as I said, it was behind on the election day. But as time has gone on, these voters who have voted late, who probably were not quite as informed, who are voting, most of those are coming in yes, at a pace of around 75% of them are coming in yes. So there's a good chance that 3 will end up passing, and if it does, then that money will be made available. I personally think it's going to be too much too fast, but we'll deal with that when we get to it.
I have always been thinking water is as water. It was not until much later did I realize that water is politics.
Oh yeah.
Well, one of the challenges too for let's say Ken's organization is they are the water quality authority. His authority and what he works with is drinking water quality. And in the last few years, especially in LA County, the term water quality has had a lot to do with stormwater quality, which is not,
it's not my purview.
It's not direct drinking water or anything else.
Okay.
So sometimes the terms, I don't know if it's intentional, but they certainly do get mixed together. And it's just when you have people that are just trying to get in their car, deal with traffic, get to work, get home, take care of their kids and their mortgage, there's a lot of stuff for the average person to have to deal with and try and decipher. And I think that your phone, your computer, Twitter, all these things can sometimes add to making people more confused.
Exactly. Speaking of politics, we have a bigger issue to talk about. Remember last time we talked about the environmental policies of California, right? And we did even touch a little bit, because we did not have time to finish the whole thing, about should we or should we not, or in other words, are we doing the right thing to give up that much to environmental control?
Well,
right? That part belongs to politics.
It is politics, but it's also common sense. We live in a world that is also occupied by animals and plants that are critical to our way of life in terms of what we do. And so we need to keep into consideration, we need to consider those when we vote. The problem is when we get out to the extremes, when we take things to the far end of the spectrum, where we're not allowing water to flow through the delta, as an example, because of a small fish that happens to be habitating within there, and not look for solutions that really solve the problem. We've heard a lot about the twin tunnels, which are taking water around the delta, and Metropolitan Water District has committed to pay for both of those twin tunnels. That is a good move for Southern California. Northern California is really opposing it because they think it's going to take water out of the delta. But Southern California are going to benefit greatly by the amount of water coming around the delta. But the other thing that it does is it also solves many of the environmental issues. A lot of the environmental problems in the delta are because we have altered the flow. Instead of water coming down the Sacramento River and in the San Joaquin River and then flowing out through San Francisco, under San Francisco Bridge, what we're doing is we're pumping water at the southern end of the delta, and we're pulling the water over to the southern end of the delta instead of out to the San Francisco. So now the fish are totally confused. They don't know. They normally, for hundreds of thousands of years, they have been following the water out to the ocean. Now all of a sudden, this water is going in a different direction, and they don't know what to do with it. And that's kind of what the environmental community is talking about.
Can we tell them?
So yeah, and we put signs up, but it doesn't help. So it's one of those things that we have to keep in mind, that we've got to come up with real solutions. Those fish should not be hampered by what we're doing, and there's no need to. We know enough now to be able to solve those problems.
Good point. Let's take a short moment out. I, for a long time, have a problem with that, and I want to make it understood by my audiences. And this is the more important. You might be bargaining or about 1 or 2 or 3% of water, though, and you do not even know we are all offering about 50% of the water to do nothing. All right, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Hello, my dear friends, my lovely audiences, my dear fellow Californians who care about water. Welcome back to the show, Jack Chow on the East West Show, with ICT-TV talking about water. California is dry enough to be considered as one of the driest kind of state of the United States. With me are 2 professionals and authorities too of water, with Mr. Tony Zampiello. He is the Water Master of California, and with Mr. Ken Manning, he is the Water Quality Control of California. With him, we're talking about the two Q's of water: quantity, quality. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, the thing is that for talking about quantity, though, suppose Mother Nature gives a whole pie of 100%, no? Mm-hmm. We have everything to take care of. Now it comes to how you allocate the water, mm-hmm. right? So how much do we offer to environmental control?
Well, of that pie that you just described, which is essentially all the rain and snow that falls on California, 50% of that moisture, that rain and snow, will end up satisfying environmental needs. It goes in all the plants that are up in the mountains and on the valley floors. All of the fish, all of the environmental needs take about 50% of the water. So now we start divvying up the other 50%. Mm-hmm. Of that other 50%, even a portion of that needs to go to some environmental, because you need to have the right flows of the right temperature at the right times for fish, and you need to have places for animals to be able to drink, and so some of that is actually used. But the majority of that 50% that's left will go to agriculture. It won't go to what we see coming into our homes and stuff. The majority of that, of that entire pie that you described, probably only about maybe 5% or less actually is water that we consume and use in our homes and factories.
All right. Okay, now back to the whole pie, though. Still whole pie. From the allocation point of view, still, do we have to give up 50% to environmental?
Well, I think if you look at it just at a basic level, and complying with current laws, you do. And there are certain instances within the system where probably certain fish species that are very key to economical factors like salmon and to the overall balance in nature, there's always the argument each year, because the climate varies, put aside whether climate change is there or not, that seasons vary and everything, that these particular species do need certain flows, like Ken said, and everything else. There are, I think, where we need to get closer together is there are practical solutions that can do both. So in other words, the bigger question to me is that, this valley 1,000 years ago, there were just a few native inhabitants, and the rivers weren't lined or anything else. And so you can't realistically say, well, the only real way to fix it is to go back to the way it was 1,000 years ago. But maybe the real practical way to approach it is that we have people living here now. How can we support these ecosystems and still at certain points in the system use that water? Because again, for benefit of environment, a lot of the nutrients and things that end up in the ocean because of the way that we've developed maybe don't need to be there. So maybe some of the end use of that water.
Yeah, that's a good angle to look at the problem. And we have been forgotten one thing. You mentioned about the last century for, say, early 30s, 40s, right? And from then on, for the past 100 years, let's say past 50 years, California population has almost doubled, right? So, and do we adjust our policies by the same ratio?
Well, what you have to call adaptive management, and the state of California uses this adaptive management through changing of its laws. And as our population grow, our policies and our laws change. For instance, there weren't any restrictions on watering your lawns and the way you were putting landscaping on in your front yards. We're seeing a transition now to where government is saying, at the advice of people who are experts at it, including Tony and I, that we think that that's a good trend. That we need to take of that water. Again, we talked about the pie. Of the water that we use in our homes, still 70% of it goes to outside watering. Well, if we could take that 70% and make it available for consumptive use, we solve some of our problems. So what we're doing is talking to people about changing the way they landscape, the way they use water in their homes and around their homes, so that we can have more water for consumptive uses. So those are the kind of things, the policies that change, and they're constantly being reviewed, always being looked at as to whether or not we're meeting the needs. Tony made a good point in that we're not going to be able to return back to the days of the 1600s or before. That's not going to happen. I mean, back in the 1600s, grizzly bears wandered through the San Gabriel Valley freely. That's not going to happen. So we need to have adaptive changes, and most of those can be policy changes or engineering changes that we can make. We just need to be realistic about what it is the problems we're trying to solve, and not try and oversolve them or undersolve them. We need to be able to look at them realistically.
We people understand that along with the growth of population, there has to be some adjustment made to laws, right? But the thing is that when you put the politics inside, though, things are changed. Things change from the fundamental level of where it should go. For example, I'll give you an example, right? In between the human and the fish, who are more important, right? The question you do not need to answer. And yet, looking at what we do, though, do we realize that as our principle? That's go ahead.
But I think a simpler way to look at it, because some of these ecosystems are very complex, is to look at it like where we stand now with the burn of fossil fuels in our vehicles and how much more efficient our vehicles are. It would make no sense to say, well, we're burning that much less oil, so we don't have to worry about continuing to develop electric cars and everything. And so there's finally, because of the smog, in the early 70s when I was a kid, you could not see those mountains. You could not breathe in a summer. Yeah. You couldn't go in the swimming pool because the mix of the chlorine in the water was almost, it'd knock you out almost. And so we've moved so far ahead, and one could argue that we burn less oil even with a bigger population, but it makes no sense to not continue and try and be efficient. So it's the same way to me with water use. Yes, that there are folks that are totally dedicated on both sides to we need to build more dams and it shouldn't matter at all in the environment. And then there are folks that say, well, regardless of whatever the impact to the environment, there just shouldn't be any. And I think the only thing that's going to prevail long term is something that's realistic in the middle, and it's very close to my mind like the automakers are. I mean, the state sets these zero emission goals and all that stuff. The technology doesn't exist to go to zero emission. And as long as, like Ken said, if you adapt your management style to say we have this goal in 2005, one of the things we haven't talked about is that we haven't even reached 2020. Arnold Schwarzenegger and the folks there, and I think I have the right regime, set a goal of reducing water use by 20% by 2020. We reached that 5 years ago, but the water industry hasn't stopped. We haven't said, okay, well, we've met all those goals, so let's let people waste. That doesn't make sense. So
that's exactly what Ken just mentioned. He says, doing the right thing is okay, right? Yeah. It is always okay to do the right thing, but you don't want to do the extreme.
Right.
So if I say we are too much on the extreme side, am I right?
Well, I think in some people's minds, I think there are times, politics in California and politics across the country is that you use the old pendulum kind of a analogy, and I think sometimes we do drift into the extremes. Right now, I would say we're probably maybe a little bit too far into the extremes right now. We need to bring that back to reality, and there are those who say that we're not extreme enough at this point. But that debate that's a constant debate that has to go on. And of course, in the legislatures, they talk about these issues. Locally, we talk about these issues. We need to be talking to each other because the laws that are created have got to fit our circumstances. In the case of water, it's just ever changing. Things are changing quickly through the state of California. And, it was just a few years ago that we created laws that made sure that water was being managed statewide. We've been lucky because locally we've been managing water for a long time, decades. But in the rest of the state, they haven't been doing that. They've just been using water as they want it. And so now we need to make sure that water is managed statewide. Okay. And so that's another change that's been made.
Well, and water is just one of the issues, right? So if you look at how we've progressed with water and then you say, I would say I feel 1,000 times safer drinking out of my tap maybe than I did in the 60s because of technology. I'm not sure I feel as safe out on the street
do it now.
Without more police or more, So it's kind of like a lot of people that focus on these issues have the luxury of kind of doing it in a vacuum and saying, well, we need to spend $10 billion more on this water issue, and it's absolutely right. But then you've got congestion, you've got safety, you've got all these other things that have to be considered. And one thing that didn't come up is that the election, there were the propositions, but at least as far as it goes to water, we've heard some positive things kind of coming from the transition team for the new governor, but we don't know where he's fully going to stand on things like the Delta and some of these critical issues. And Ken probably knows a lot more about that.
Of course, to reach the 2020 goal, that's right, and we already realized that goal already. But to look back in a retrospective point of view, do we have to? Why can't we slow down a little bit, do it gradually, not doing the one step, by cutting ourselves short of a supply of even water? So this is too much to the average people.
Yeah.
Do you think that we have a problem with that nature?
Well, no, I really don't, because I think that for the most part, the public policies that are being adapted are looking at this at the point in time in which they're being made. When about 5 years ago, when the state said we are in a drought and people need to conserve, and the whole concept of 20% reduction by 2020, that was all during a 5-year drought. Now we know that droughts in California will go longer than 5 years, but we happen to have a 5-year drought. So you know, like we're really, Tony and I both believe we're in a multiple decade drought. We really are. So we're actually, if you look at it over about a 20-year period, we've only had 4 or 5 really good rain years. The rest of it's been drought. But those policies are changing over time in terms of how much water you're using. And so I think that really we are doing what you're talking about, is that things are happening gradually. Nobody said you can't use water on your front yard. Nobody's told you that. All they've said is you can only water your lawn on maybe Tuesdays and Thursdays. They said you can't water. They're not telling you can't water. They're just restricting the amount of water you can use over time. So those are important things, is that I think eventually you're going to get to a point where the state or the local entities are going to say, we prefer you not have water on your outside at all, because we just don't have that much quantity of water. Now, we're not there yet, but I think in 30, 40 years, we could be there.
To my audience, the one thing to sum up, though, it is time to change our lifestyle, right? Either you call it, or Mother Nature call it, or legislature call it, or the water supply itself call it. We really have to. Really have to. This morning, my wife reminded me I was brushing my teeth and I had the tap going.
Shame on you, Jack.
Yeah, shame on me. She said, you're talking about water today, right? Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good reminder.
Yeah.
So she had my schedule, knowing my subject today.
Yeah.
You're talking about the water today, right? Oh, yeah, I did it, right? So to do that, all right, to mutually remind each other and try to do something. After all, it is for ourselves. As how or why our legislators did what they did, and why can't we slow down whatsoever? They are not going against us. They are pushing us too much. All right? Well, anyway, regardless of whatever happened, it is time to call for a lifestyle change. With that as a conclusion, I thank to my dear friend Tony Zampiello, Water Master, and I thank my dear friend Ken Manning, Water Quality. With the 2 Qs of water, I believe California can survive a little bit, can hang on a little bit, finally, till we survive. All right? Thank you very much for watching, my dear friends.